Retrospective on Battle for Azeroth. Now that the Shadowlands beta is on the horizon, and I literally have nothing better to do, it's time for me to write a comprehensive review of BFA that I promised to my stream about 6 months ago. A fair warning, this will be very long. An even more important warning, these are my opinions. Your opinion might be different from mine, and that's okay. I always welcome reasoned discussion and discourse. I'm going to try and break this up into categories and sections. For those of you who are only interested in, let's say, PvP or the Heart of Azeroth, I'll also be covering literally every detail of the game I can think of, from raiding to pet battles to transmog. So this is going to be a very, very long post. Share with your friends if you agree. My main goal is to make sure that Shadowlands doesn't repeat the same mistakes as BFA and also Legion. So, when Battle for Azeroth was announced, I was extremely excited about the idea of a faction conflict-based expansion. After defeating a literal titan in Nentorus and stopping Sargeras, the only thing that would make sense is for the next formidable opponent to be ourselves. After the announcement, the hype was only building when I saw the idea of warfronts and how they would be playing out in the original Warcraft 2 tech trees. Everything with the expansion looked great on paper, but unfortunately, that was the most excited for BFA I would ever be. The reason I'm making this is because I don't want Shadowlands to turn out to be the same thing. Questing and leveling. I'll be completely honest. I hated BFA leveling more than anything I've hated in any other expansion's leveling. I would rather pay the $60 to boost from 110 to 120 than level the character myself. There's a number of reasons why BFA leveling is such a disappointment, but I think the biggest one is that you actively feel your character getting weaker and more clunky to play as you level up. Losing your endgame secondary stat allocations, plus 30 haste, for example, is something that we're used to in every expansion, but with BFA we also lost legendaries, artifact weapons, tier sets, and our trinkets, such as Convergence of Fate, Pantheon trinkets, etc. The reason that was almost The result of that was almost a feeling of dread every time you leveled up, knowing that you were only one or two or however many levels away your character was from losing those traits and abilities that made playing it feel great during Legion. Compound that with the loss of your artifact weapon and the addition of the GCD change, you've got yourself a straight downgrade in class feeling from 110 to 120. The most telling way to explain this is the fact when Blizzard announced that they were removing XP off from 110s, there was a massive outcry from players because so many of them would rather play their 110s than their 120s. The actual quests themselves were okay. Nothing exciting or challenging, but okay. Basically, Blizzard took all of the innovative things that they had made with WoD questing and threw it in the garbage in a favor of bland, boring questing experience. Cool and challenging rares that drop quest items? Gone. Treasures that will reward XP for finding them? Gone. Interesting choices that help you level through the zone? Effing gone. Even the bonus objectives were awful because the time it took them to complete them made doing the quest more often not. I'm sorry. Even the bonus objectives were awful because the time that it took to complete them made doing the quests more often than not the more time efficient choice. Instead of the dynamic bonus objectives in WoD and Legion that took a decent amount of time, you had BFA's bonus objectives where you had to kill 50 pigs. Overall, BFA had the worst leveling of any expansion and had many players questioning what the point even was in leveling up if I was going to be in such a monotonous experience. I love questing, I love leveling. Most expansions I get every character to max level. With BFA I only leveled half and all of them besides my main were leveled in islands, not through quests. That's how much I hated it. War campaign slash max level quests. Just like the leveling experience, I think Blizzard really dropped the ball on the war campaign quest. And no other way was it a bad leveling experience, but I think the max level quest was more of a missed opportunity than anything else. For me, I tried to pay attention to the lore, but for the most part, I was mindlessly running through quests, going to the different map markers and killing mobs that were lit up or the items that were sparkling. It was a very boring, bland, meaningless experience. The quest offered no challenge. I could stand in danger zones while fighting all the quest bosses and not even go under 90% health. After completing the quest, the only thing I really got out of them was AP, which didn't feel good either. I would love if, in Shadowlands, the main quest lines for max levels were going to be made more challenging and the bosses for the quest lines were proper elites that required a formal group. I also think that removing the quest objectives and trackers from the map that assist you in completing the quest would make a huge improvement in improving players' competency in the lore. While yes, there are add-ons that would do that, and yes, it would make things take longer, I think it would be an improvement and make the game better. For a parallel, many of the people who played Classic understood the conflict between Defias versus Stormwind and having an understanding of why it was important why it I'm sorry, understood the conflict between Defias and Stormwind and had an understanding of why it was happening and who Edwin Van Cleef was. A big reason for this was because they had to actively read the quest in order to figure out what to do and the process of doing that. They absorbed the lore. Having to read the quest forced the player to learning the lore, and with max level storylines, that's a good thing. It goes without saying, but the rewards should be increased so the quests are compelling for players. 3000 Azerite power for fighting the Fourth War sucks. It doesn't feel good. In Shadowlands, I like to see max level quests not have quest trackers, be more challenging, and offer better rewards. World quests. World quests in BFA were a downgrade from Legion. They took longer and gave less rep. This was an this This was even a goal with Blizzard when they stated it was a problem that traveling to a world quest took less time than the actual world quest. If you remember in Legion, the Blue Elite world quest would give more rep than the normal ones, and BFA it was all the same. This slowed down the reputation gains and made the grind to Exalted take longer. I had a lot of fun in Legion, being able to do the entire world quest in one pull. It was cool to test myself that way. The problem Blizzard identified with World Quest seemed like more of a problem than game developers have with the game rather than players. The 8.1 incursions faction-based World Quest were basically the Legion invasion minus the cool Legion ships and transmog items. They were a nice addition, but the rewards for completing the incursion were so awful that the only reason that you do them is for the 7th Legion service medals. They also lacked the consequence that the Legion invasions had with how they would change the skybox and alter the zone with much more when they were active. In 8.2, Blizzard made a ton of huge improvements in the world quests and made Nazahar and Mechagon world quests in general much more interesting and fun than their release counterparts. Even now, if I'm in Nazahar and Mechagon, I'll do a few world quests. The idea of lumping all the world quests into one in Mechagon was also really cool. The Bejeweled world quests and other mini-games in Nazjahar were fun too. I hope Blizzard ports them into Shadowlands, sparingly of course. The 8.3 quests were fine too, even though they're not world quests, they're dailies, which is basically the same thing. They're boring, but not too annoying. I don't think they'll do them that often after I get exalted though. In my opinion, 8.2 Najahar and Mechagon dailies were the best iteration of daily content that we've had in BFA and even in Legion. They combined the Legion style world quest with a more traditional daily quest style while at the same time having both of them feed into each other and overlap. They also added new types of goals and objectives that broke up the monotony of go here, kill this, click that. I hope they use that in 8.2 as a starting point when designing daily content in Shadowlands. Island expeditions. Oh boy. The main reason why people disliked islands is because they seemed mandatory for reaching Azerite armor breakpoints. If they were standalone content that had cosmetic rewards, I think I think people would have a much less requirement towards them. Feeling like you had to do islands in order to stay competitive in raiding slash PvP was one of the worst parts of the expansion. Even farming for traits in your artifact weapon with Mauve Souls was better because at least you would also be able to hope for a Titan Forge. With islands, unless you cared about the mounts, cosmetics, the only reward was AP. With the amount of AP required decreasing every week, it felt like you were on an arbitrary treadmill that had no respect for the player's time. The actual gameplay of islands was decent, I guess. I've always been a fan of pulling everything in a dungeon and AoEing it all down in massive pulls. So islands were fun for me in that way. But I still do something but they sorry. I still do them sometimes, but after I get all the mounts, I'll probably only do the weekly. But the bonus objective for islands always seemed like a waste of time. After you got enough gear to do just big pulls, that's kind of a good thing, but at the same time, the barrier for doing that was so low that I almost no one I know does the bonus objectives. The doubloon vendor came in way too late by the time I did it. I'm sorry. The doubloon vendor came in way too late by the time it did. Written a little bit oddly, but okay. People had already made up their mind regarding islands. Also, Blizzard delaying the vendor for the mount until 8.3 was another example of them not respecting the player's time. The vendors should have been there on release. If they were, I think many more players would have had a more positive outlook on the islands. PvP islands were probably the biggest missed opportunity in all of BFA. It was the first time Blizzard actually made a game mode that incorporated PvP and PvE simultaneously, where both contributed towards an end goal. The concept of PvP islands was great and had a ton of potential, but it was squandered by Blizzard with a lack of compelling rewards and competitive integration/support. Overall, Blizzard did a good job improving islands throughout BFA, and I hope in Shadowlands or something similar we continue in a non-required way. Blizzard has a habit of iterating on content and efficiently having the community beta test a feature for the entirety of an expansion, only for it to be in a good state by the end of the expansion and be removed when the next one comes out. Azurite Armor. Remember what I said about how Blizzard would release a feature and have the player base spend the entirety of an expansion testing it only for it to be beta testing it only for it to be in a good playable state at the end of the expansion, then be forgotten or removed entirely? Yeah, that's Azurite Armor. Azurite Armor was probably one of the biggest pain points of the start of the expansion, and now is probably one of the better features of BFA. I I like Azurite Armor in 8.3. Do I like it more than Legendaries at the end of Legion? No, but why not both? I think in general, WoW needs another layer of customization for characters just beyond the talent point system. Hopefully, Shadowlands Works will explore that. At the start of the expansion, Azurite was extremely hard to come by, and had a huge impact in determining how powerful your character was. Without the residual vendor, the only way you could get Azurite was through your weekly box via a random roll of the dice. The traits were wildly imbalanced, and while some were really fun and gameplay changing, like the Inevitable Demise and Test of Might, those were other boring procs with overpowered damage such as Thunderous Blast. If I remember right, it wasn't tradable. Around the time 8.2 came out, most of the Azurite traits were more in line with each other, and the gameplay changing ones tended to be the most powerful. This was a good change and began the redemption arc for Azurite armor. By the time Eternal Palace released, Azurite armor was in a good place, and now at 8.3, I'd say that I don't mind it. The main thing I dislike about Azurite armor is the fact that you need to have 3 different pieces for each spec. So for me, since I play all specs, I have to carry around 3 or 4 helmets, one for each spec, one for PvP. That's too much, and I don't like the choice it forces you into making. I would also be okay with if the choice of the respec of Azurite armor didn't literally double every time you wanted to make a change. If it capped at, let's say, 5,000 gold, I'd be fine with having spec specific Azurite armor. Almost all the changes that Azurite armor went through during BFA were changes that were suggested during the beta of the expansion. If Azurite armor teaches Blizzard anything, it's that they should listen to their player base and be more agile with making changes. Releasing something that's generally disliked alienates players, and some of them don't come back. Any players quit in Legion when they didn't get their best in slot legendaries and couldn't find groups or lost their raid spot. Azerite armor, I'm sure, was no different. First impressions are so important with anything, especially games, and with BFA, the worst first impression possible on so many people with Azerite armor, among other things. Warfronts. Coming from someone who was originally ecstatic about Warfronts because of my history growing up playing Warcraft 2 and seeing Warfronts using the same tech tree, I'd have to say that Warfronts were probably the biggest disappointment in BFA for me personally. Everything about Warfronts could be used as a metaphor for what's wrong with Blizzard's current design and philosophy. Random rewards, you can't lose unless you try to, trivial difficulty in general, random meaningless grouping, time gating, everything. Sometimes it feels like Blizzard is afraid to let players lose. What they don't realize is when you can't lose, it doesn't matter if you win. I could go on and on about how much Warfronts suck, but I think almost everyone agrees with me. I also think a lot of people agree that heroic Warfronts were a huge improvement. They're still kind of lacking on difficulty, however. In a perfect world, I would have liked if a third tier of difficulty, a PvP Warfront, could have been a PvP version of Warfronts could have been really cool too, something like Ashran with a more traditional Warcraft theme. Yes, the greatest thing about Warfronts is at the end. Heart of Azeroth. Maybe I'm the only one, but I know the first time I go into Alpha for Shadowlands, I shift. Oh, okay. I'm not sure if this is. Okay, yeah, he mistyped here. Maybe I'm the only one, but I know the first time I got into the alpha for Battle for Azeroth, not Shadowlands, he wrote Shadowlands, I shift clicked my Heart of Azeroth to open it up in the same way I would my artifact weapon. Little did I know that I'd have to wait two major content patches after the game released in order to do that. In its current state, with essences and only the last +5 item level increases being a grind for players to get their Azerite armor, I don't hate the Heart of Azeroth. The arbitrary benchmarks of Heart of Azeroth levels that you had to reach in order to unlock traits on your Azerite gear that you already had last year is something that again is insulting to players and disrespectful of their time. If a game ever wants to make you feel like you're wasting your time, that's a huge game design problem. If there was ever a point where I didn't feel like I wasn't wasting my time when leveling my Heart of Azeroth. The artifact knowledge system that decreased the amount you needed for each level on a weekly basis also served to create a sense of fulfillity and powerlessness. Why farm it when you can just wait 3 weeks and do it in literally half the time? Conversely, imagine how raiders felt when they were heart compelled to farm Azerite levels, knowing how much easier it would be in just a couple weeks due to a completely arbitrary throttling system. It felt good hitting 52 in my artifact weapon in Nighthold because I finished the AK and had stopped at that point. If I had known in just a couple weeks everyone would be able to reach 52 in half the time it took me, I would have felt stupid. While yes, resets, catch up mechanics are sometimes needed, when they happen too quickly, one after the other, it makes players apathetic. By the time 8.2 released, the Heart of Azeroth was in a good place, and with the addition of essences, I think it's a good system. However, I do wish there was a degree of customization you could have inside the heart. Similar to how traits work inside the artifact weapon, I guess that's what Azerite armor was though. Essences. I like essences. I think they were a positive addition to the game. I like how they require you to play different aspects of the game, PvE, PvP, Mythic Plus, and I feel they all matter. I consider having to do PvP for Blood of the Enemy a good thing. Most things that they encourage interplay between PvPers and PvEers is positive thing in general. I think WoW in the last two expansions has run into the problem of players wanting to only play one element of the game and thus expecting that element of the game to be completely all-encompassing ecosystems in terms of rewards. This has caused the community to self-segregate and create micro-communities that all have conflicting wants and needs. However, essences should be account-wide. Thank you. Even if they don't want to make a flatline account wide unlock, they should at least make it to where if you get a rank 4 essence, rank 3 is unlocked on the rest of your account. Right now, right now there's literally 0% chance of me playing my alt seriously, and one big reason for that is having to re-level my essences. I hope the philosophy of essences carries on into Shadowlands. Gearing in general, Titan forging, gems, corruptions, trinkets. Blizzard removing Titan forging was what I hoped for. Blizzard also removing Warforging was more than I could have hoped for. I'm so happy they did that, and both of those were the reason why I stopped raiding and caring about my gear. Nowadays, I'm trying to figure out a way to make a raiding team for my stream again so that I can get mythic gear. For me, Blizzard gave me everything that I wanted with gearing in 8.3, and then some. Having the socket that you could buy from Rathion for mementos was something I and many other people had asked for, and seeing it was effing awesome. More deterministic gear and progression is a good thing. Trinkets and BFA have been a hit and miss. As a warrior, I've generally enjoyed Ashvane's / Origoza trinket combo, and I like the trinkets that work in a sort of force multiplier for each other. In general, I like trinkets that change in a way that you add an extra button that isn't 1000 more haste, or trinkets that look more badass than Deathbringer's will. I hope in Shadowlands they'll add more trinkets that enhance your character and change how you play rather than increase your stats by X. Armor in general in BFA has been pretty boring though. Comparing the armor pieces I had in MOP to the ones I have now is depressing. There's so much more customization that went into them, reforging, 3 gem sockets, enchants, etc. It doesn't feel right to get a pair of gloves and not have to enchant them. I'd like to see enchants and multiple gem slots make their way back in the armor in Shadowlands 2. Another thing I like about 8.3 is the fact that there are still some pieces from Eternal Palace that are good. In a perfect world, I'd like to see more interplay between raids rather than when a raid comes out, it replaces literally everything you have. Having 2 to 3 pieces that are relevant from the previous tier makes the game feel more expansive to me. The idea of corruption on gear is a cool one. I even like I even like a lot of the effects that the corruptions do, but the problem with them usually lies with their balancing and acquisition. When they have a trade like Infinite Stars that massively outperforms literally nearly all of the other traits that are in the same drop table, you create a system of disappointment. The problem also lies with how infinite stars occurs on items. There have been plenty of examples in WoW's history where an item gives someone a massive damage increase. How many massive two-handed weapons from the last boss of a raid gave someone a huge bonus in their damage? I remember killing Heroic Ragnaros and getting Sulfuris and my damage went up by a huge margin. It was awesome. The difference between that and Infinite Stars is the chance of it happening. When Sulfuris has an 8% chance of dropping from Heroic Rag, you can reasonably assume that after a month or two of farming the item, you'll probably get it. When you start adding levels of RNG, that's when the problem happens and the assumption fades away. Now, instead of only having to worry about a binary yes or no drop of the items, you now have, did it drop? Will it get corrupted? Was it the right corruption? Was it the right tier of corruption? All these layers of RNG have to align and are dependent on each other. If the item doesn't drop, then it can't be corrupted. And if it has the wrong corruption, it doesn't matter what tier it is. When 10,000 DPS relies on you rolling 4 levels of RNG, a feeling of powerlessness and apathy begins to emerge. Why try when someone else has a massive advantage over you for purely being lucky? Taking agency and control away from players and dealing it instead of the fickle hands of fate is a surefire way to make sure no one wants to play your game. In a short-term solution, In short, a short-term solution to the corruption problem would be dramatically increase the chances of corruptions on gear from Nyalotha to maybe even 100%, especially Mythic. I know already some weapons have guaranteed corruption, so the idea is something Blizzard has done already. Another solution would be to make a sort of tool that you could use to apply corruptions, maybe at the end of horrific visions. I'm okay with randomness, as long as there's a reasonable way to offset randomness by putting in more effort by rolling the dice more times. It was okay with benthic gear being very strong because of the chances of getting the right benthic item were high enough to where someone could roll the dice enough times and was reasonably and I'm sorry. I was okay with benthic gear being very strong because the chances of getting the right benthic item were high enough to where someone who rolled the dice enough times was reasonably expect to get the item they wanted. With corruptions and Titan forging before then, that wasn't the case. While I think corruptions are an upgrade over Titan forging, there are some extreme outliers that make a hard point to sell. If Infinite Stars was nerfed to be more in line with the rest of corruptions, and they were common enough to where you could expect them to get via drops or through applying them to gear in some way, I'd expect the system to be a success. The fact that Blizzard has let certain corruptions be overpowered for this long is an effing disgrace. It's almost as if they don't care. After losing tier sets, Legion Legendaries, artifact weapons, and adding the GCD change, it's no surprise that most classes don't feel great. Almost everyone I've talked to agrees that Legion and even WoD had better class design than BFA. Losing out on all those things above at the same time left a huge void that unfortunately Azerite armor couldn't fill. Warriors got a lot of changes in BFA, and in general, Fury is one of the better specs to play, but I would trade it all away for the chance to play Fury and Nighthold again. A huge problem with classes right now is that there's so much of their damage comes from involuntary sources. If you're going to play the game right now, go to a target dummy, or next time you do a boss, afterwards open up your damage breakdown and look to see how much of your damage is applied directly through a spell you press and how much is a random proc, dot, and everything else. One thing that Classic did right is that if you feel like is makes you feel that when you hit your modal strike, you see the damage it deals. In BFA, I never feel that way because so much of my damage breakdown is made up of random procs and uncontrollable things. Think about how much damage it would feel if instead of those random procs, your main abilities did 30 to 40% more damage. For me personally, there's at least 5 damage procs that come into play every time I hit my target. One of the things I really enjoyed about parsing and trying to complete for logs back in the day is that I was on a pretty even playing field with other people that I was competing against. On Siege of Orgrimmar, everyone on top 100 had pretty much the exact same gear. While Warforging was in the game back then, everyone had farmed the tier for so long that we all pretty much played all Mythic Warforged BIS. In BFA, the amount of Titan forging slash socket random RNG made parsing for me much less interesting and enjoyable. Corruption is the same thing. I'm sure if I had rank 3 infinite stars 460 plus item, I'd be more willing to do it, but it wouldn't feel as good because I know I was beating people based off luck and not skill. Blizzard has this fixation on randomness to muddy the water between a good player and a bad player. But what it ends up doing is making the players care less about which one they are. In Shadowlands, I hope Blizzard can move away from random procs and modifiers that are out of players' control and instead move towards building a damage kit of classes directly into their spells rather than procs that are tied to them. A small note, make white crits big again, like it was in vanilla to Wrath of the Lich King. Do it, and bring back tier sets. Raids. The raids in WoW are always good. I forget the last time that Blizzard released a genuinely bad raid. BFA has been no different. I'll admit though, my raiding experience, Mythic at least, is not what it once was, so my opinions on raiding beyond old years should only be applied to Heroic and under, as I don't do the Mythic fights when they're relevant or challenging. I suppose that instead of instead of rating the raids, I can explain why I quit raiding. Honestly, the biggest reason was time and burnout. At that point, I was streaming WoW 6 hours a day, and I'd raid for 4 hours plus another hour for administration stuff that was given that I'm because I'm the GM of the raid of my guild. 11 hours a day is too much. A lot of days I play for 11 hours, but it's all on my own terms and not required. The second season I took a break was that the second reason I took a break was the rewards weren't compelling enough. Hall of Fame was a good idea and a good addition to the game, but the fact is that there are so many titles in the game now that none of them really mean anything outside of old school titles like Scarab Lord or Rank 1 arenas. The gear was nice, but other people could get the same gear by putting 5% of the effort in Heroic and being lucky. Before anyone comments on this, yes, I do want unique power advantages for completing mythic content. To me, I've always played and worked towards goals that have a sense of exclusivity. My goal every tier is to get best in slot. Since WOD, this is impossible since there's no coincidence in I'm sorry. My goal every tier is to get best in slot. Since WOD, this is impossible, and it's no coincidence that I've stopped enjoying raiding. Titan forging and increased randomness on gear made me feel like time I spent raiding was wasted, and I felt stupid investing over 10 hours a week on a schedule to be 5 item levels higher than a heroic raider. My goal is raiding. My goal of raiding is gear. Prestige in it is nice, but I'm not willing to invest time into being that serious about the game to reach a level of prestige that I'm proud of. Another thing that has become more common in raiding, specifically in Tomb of Sargeras, is mechanics. When one person fails them, the entire raid wipes. I hate mechanics like that, because they add an increased level of stress when you finally overcome them. There's no, re- there's more relief of satisfaction. The biggest problem to me with raiding is actually something that has to do with the entire game, which is when a new patch comes out, everything before that patch is irrelevant. The baddest gear you had in Eternal Palace is replaced with normal gear in Nyalotha. Same with Mythic Plus and everything else related to gear progression. In BFA and also Legion, you didn't play the expansion, you played the patch. While I see why Blizzard wants to approach it from that direction, I personally dislike it because I feel it removes content from the game. If someone just started BFA now and had to go through Old Year, BLD, Eternal Palace, that would create a lot more content for that player to work towards rather than repeating the same raid 4 times. In a perfect place, I'd love to see something like they did with Terrace of Eternal Springs. You had your normal mode, your hard mode, and then on top of that, you had hard mode with the Protectors of the Endless having an elite mode on top of that. And same thing in Old War. Overall, I think we need a reduction in raid difficulties down to 3, but ideally 2. Not only would it be better experience for players coming into the expansion late, but I think it would also help with the item level inflation problem people that makes people who would take one tier off feels like they have to start all over again. From my heroic raider perspective, rating has been fine, but I would defer to someone who's mythic rated for the entire expansion for a more nuanced evaluation. A quick note, I just remembered, I really like what they did with the gear in Crucible Storms. Almost every item had a sort of buff or effect it created, and things like that make gearing in raids more interesting in general. And I hope Blizzard adds more of those in the future. Dungeons and Mythic Plus. BFA dungeons have been good. Mechagon, however, I think is one of the best dungeons Blizzard has made since Classic or BRD. It's better than Return to Karazhan even. The implementation of Mega Dungeons I also think is great. Mythic only with hard mode. I love it. If I had to choose, I'd say that I enjoyed Legion Dungeons more, while Megagon is my favorite out of the 2 expansions. Legion has had more dungeons that I liked in general. One of the big reasons, I think, is the main way I interfere with dungeons is through Mythic Plus, and the way that the fixes for Legion were ported over to BFA felt lazy. It's clear to me that fixes for Mythic Plus were designed for Legion dungeon slash mobs and not for BFA. In most cases, this isn't really a problem, but some fixes do not work well with certain dungeons and mobs. Like an example is the amount of mobs in BFA that stand still and perform an action. Whether that's something like shooting a gun, applying a buff to themselves, or casting an uninterruptible spell. While there are some mobs in Legion, there are many more in BFA. Dealing with mobs like that on weeks with Sanguine creates some very frustrating situations. There's counterplay for it, of course, but just because something has a counterplay potential doesn't mean that it's a good mechanic or interaction. Also, when players outplay potential, it's only available to players who are in, let's say, the top 5% groups, and 95% of players have a frustrating experience that's created by an unplanned interaction. Another example is Sanguine, again in a dungeon like Toll the Gore, taking a mechanic from Legion dungeons, many of which were in a open and expansive, and applying to it a claustrophobic dungeon like Toll the Gore creates again frustrating situations. There are good and bad and kinds of frustration. From my perspective, that's the bad kind. The seasonal fix, reaping, infested, etc., I think were a good addition to Mythic Plus, and they really serve to spice things up and make the dungeon more interesting. I enjoy reaping and awakened, and I thought beguiling and infested were annoying. In general, I like things that accelerate combat rather than slow it down or throttle it. Gear for Mythic Plus is kind of in a weird spot right now. I think Blizzard has struggled to balance Mythic Plus gearing because of how much more accessible it is versus Mythic rating and the fact that it's repeatable. Doing a Mythic plus 15 is probably as hard as doing some of the Mythic bosses, but I'd say doing something like a plus 18 is extremely challenging, much more so than most of the kinds of Mythic rating. At least that's how it was when I was raiding. I thought it would be nice if there was a way to get more than one Mythic raid level piece per week from Mythic Plus, but that's a tough balance to strike. I hope that in Shadowlands Blizzard can reimagine the Mythic Plus system and its rewards. The 8.3 edition of 15 of the plus 15 mount and title was a great start. More rewards built around Mythic Plus and progressing through the item levels is a good thing. What if there was a kind of feat for completing a plus 20 or all plus 20s that rewarded a title like Keymaster? That would be really cool. Mythic Plus should have a lot more rewards than what it currently has, and I think almost everyone who does the content can agree with that. Also, why aren't there legendary keys? I don't know why. Horrific visions. Good. They're good. I like them. Horrific visions are to BFA what the Mage Tower was to Legion. Challenging solo content. Where the Mage Tower is more geared towards, doing it on all your characters. The visions are focused on progression system for one character. While having an entire tech tree for just a patch feature might seem a little excessive, I do like how the ecosystem of corruption works together. Corrupted gear, the legendary cloak upgrades, and the visions together incentivize each other to make each other relevant and useful. The visions also by extension make character progression in general matter by allowing you to complete more of the objectives with more masks. The visions themselves I think are fun to do. I've done 3 of them. I've done them so far with 3 masks and it was pretty easy. I think I think next week or the week after I'll go for 5. The masks were like a great idea, and I also like how different points in the tech tree unlock big benchmarks for player power. For example, when I got the bottom capstone talent, I went from being able to full clear a vision to being able to full clear a vision without even using a sanity orb. The only problems I have with visions is that you don't like the Illyria fight. You spend too much time having to wait for her to cast an ability and run to you. Because you're on a timer, it creates a lot of frustration having to wait for her to move out one of the danger zones. The rewards from the visions are good. I think that there's only one cosmetic reward rather than dozens, so that players are more incentivized uh, to upgrade their. It's phrased a little bit weird. I like that there's only one cosmetic reward rather than dozens, so that players are more incentivized to upgrade their get rather than just buy more and more cosmetics. So this is the PvP section. So World PvP and Battlegrounds. To say that World PvP is laggy and terrible would be an insult to laggy and terrible garbage. Before, never in the history of the game have I encountered such a dysfunctional and embarrassing excuse of a PvP system in the current state of open world PvP. The battle for Nazahar is unplayable in groups larger than 15 to 20. You can already start to feel your abilities lose their responsiveness and the input lag and the time you hit 30 people, World PvP loses all sense of functionality and turns into an embarrassing mess that would humiliate even indie developers. But somehow Blizzard, a multi-billion dollar company, doesn't seem to be bothered with the fact that you can't have a war in Warcraft. It seems with every other expansion and every year since the servers get worse and worse. Even do doing Tauren Mill versus South Shore is unplayable, and that's a 40v40 that Blizzard created. An interesting question to me is, however, why do so many people feel like the servers have gotten worse over time? Have they? I'll be the first to say that I'm not a network engineer and I don't have a degree in service tech. And I don't really know what I'm talking about, so I'll take what I say with a grain of salt. I think the reason why servers have deteriorated over time is the massive increase in spells, effects, calculations, and numbers that goes into PvP in general nowadays. Anyone who owns a PC knows that when you have 100 tabs open in your web browser, your computer slows down. Metaphorically, I think PvP has too many tabs open. One of the biggest problems I have with PvP right now is it seems the entire game is balanced around 3v3s. Most of the player base don't do 3v3 arenas, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that when you create a balancing strategy around 3v3 arenas, then extrapolate that to every element of the game, you're going to have some disconnects. For example, trying to get a healer down in a BG, unless they're very, very bad, you're probably not going to be able to. A big reason that is the mechanic that throttles the healers in 3v3, dampening, which isn't in BGs. Sorry about that. There are, of course, times when you've gotten a healer down solo in a BG, but that's usually because of outgearing them, lucky procs, or them just being very bad. There have been many times where I'm doing a BG and I've had 3 to 4 people on a healer and you can't get them down. That would be okay if there was some degree of skill involved, but the situations that I'm mentioning are when a healer is literally dumping circles, spamming instant casts without dying. There's not a lot of counterplay that makes them. What is it's very oddly phrased. There's not a lot of counterplay to that, and it makes trying to get them down very frustrating and an unfun experience. Let's say you're some sort of crazy person and you like fighting in BGs against healers. You like. I'm sorry. This is just. I'm not reading correctly. Let's say you're some sort of crazy person and you like fighting against healers in BGs in World PvP. You'd have to be absolutely insane to feel the same way about tanks. From my perspective, I don't see any value in having tanks in a BG when BGs doesn't have a flag. There's never been a time where I played a BG against a tank and I enjoyed it. I don't think I don't think tanks have a place in BGs outside of flag carriers and serve no purpose in arena. Tanks in BGs and arena usually exist primarily to extend the duration of the game or somehow ruin the other team. Personally, I don't think that's good gameplay, and I think it actively makes BGs and arena experience worse for everyone. Overall, World PvP and BGs don't feel good or fulfilling. Damage feels too low until someone gets one shot. Another big problem I have with PvP right now is the back-ending balancing system and how they feel Ninja implemented into BFA. If you don't know what I'm talking about, basically if you're 470 and you get hit by someone who's 420 for 50k, it may show 50k on your screen, but the other player only takes, let's say, 30k. Personally, I don't think anything like this should be present in a gear-based MMO, especially when it's lying to players to make them feel good about the damage that they're doing isn't even real. PvP gearing. Starting out at BFA, I really liked PvP gearing. It was competitive, And with rating, it was really good enough to where a lot of people who didn't normally PvP were getting into it because the rewards were so lucrative. It reminded me a lot of BC when the arena gear was so good that almost everyone was queuing 10 games a week. I like the idea of incentivizing PvE players to do PvP and vice versa. I think end of match rewards should be slightly buffed from where they are now. At this point, I get less than one item an hour and from queuing arenas, which makes it less competitive than Mythic Plus, and Mythic Plus has gear trading and also more targeted loot farming. The weekly loot reward for filling up the conquest bar seems too low as well. 445 isn't competitive with anything at this point, so I'd like to see more rewards that PvP players can deterministically work towards over the course of a week. Also, Shadowlands needs PvP vendors. Please do this. There's nothing that crushes the competitive spirit faster than an unfair playing field. Arena. This one's actually kind of short. I don't do Arena seriously enough right now to feel confident in making a judgment on it, so listen to one of the more serious Arena guys on this one. Minor features that still deserve to be discussed. Flying. Pathfinder has been a great idea for WoD and Legion, but at this point, I think players are getting tired of regrinding for the exact same thing every expansion. From my personal experience, my mom, who's been an avid WoW player since vanilla, has stopped playing and is on strike because of the way Blizzard makes players regrind for the same thing that they had in the previous expansion. Personally, I don't mind getting Pathfinder because I get it organically just doing the content, but for a lot of players it's cumbersome and having the expansion and having the expectation to do it every expansion is a bit much. Maybe in Shadowlands they could give players flying for a nominal amount of gold, 20 or 100,000, and tie Pathfinder into something like faster speed. Mounts. The mount problem with BFA and also Legion is when Blizzard releases a mount type, certain variations are substantially easier to get than others. You might think this is a irrelevant thing, but mounts and other cosmetic items are one of the biggest ways that players have to distinguish themselves from others. And when that distinction is so diminished, so is the visual representation of their accomplishments. So for example, when some of the mind worms are very easy to get and some are very hard, the visual distinction a player gets from having one is diminished. I think when Blizzard designs tiers of mounts, they should try to keep all the mounts within the same general level of difficulty. An example is Proto-Drakes in Wrath of the Lich King. Every Proto-Drake was difficult to obtain in its own way. Yes, some more than others, but there were no, free super easy Proto-Drakes when Wrath of the Lich King was released. This made having a Proto-Drake in general a prestige accomplishment. Mounts in BFA have been decent though. The Mythic Jaina mount and now the Mythic N'Zoth mounts are super unique enough to where they and stand out, and the Gladiator mounts are the same thing. Pet battles. Blizzard has done a great job with pet battles this expansion. They've also made tons of new pet battle dungeons as well as nearly 100 new pets you can go out there and find. Also, making a daily pet battle for the reputation as well at okay, one moment. Also, making a daily pet battle for the reputation as well as how they gave you quest items for even more rep in Nazjahar when you win a pet battle is a good thing. It gives people who want to interface with the minigame that small, tiny minority advantages that makes the idea of doing pet battles a little bit more compelling to those people who haven't done them. I'd like to see pet battles get an added layer of complexity, but I worry that it'll only come in the form of an arbitrary expectation to maybe, level pets to 30 or something that's purely designed to make players repeat the content. Feats of strength. Capstone levels feature feats like Champion of Azeroth and the Faceless are great for the game because they give those who are high-end players something to work towards and show off. I like to see more high-end feats of strength added into the game that give those players something that they can have to distinguish themselves. So this is the final section. Transmog. Transmog options in BFA have been pretty great overall. The biggest negative for transmog in BFA is also the biggest part of transmog, tier sets. Let's say you don't like the older plate set because you don't want to look like a stone soldier who smokes a lot. Well, you're screwed. That's the only tier set. Class tier sets also gave players tons of other options regarding transmog, and I hope Blizzard brings them back for no other reason than to give players more transmog options. And this is his last dialogue. Wow, that was a long one. Okay, I think I've covered everything, or at least I hope I have. I put a ton of work into this, so I hope a lot of you guys got something out of it. If you made it this far, thank you. As I said at the start, my main goal is to make sure that Shadowlands is a good expansion. So when Alpha, Beta, or the actual game comes out, and you have a chance to play it. Make sure you let Blizzard know how you feel and give good constructive feedback. Okay, that was Asmongold's comprehensive a retrospective on BFA by Asmongold and your narrator Bash Cutter. You guys have a good one. Thanks for listening.